Woo. Thanks. So just to start off with, can I get a show of hands of who has heard of Silverstripe before? There's a few hands. I guess I know probably only Joel. Put your hands up if you've actually used Silverstripe before. Oh, there you go, some people. That's good. If you've used Silverstripe before, then the demo at the end of this maybe, hopefully will be something that you've seen before or have done similar things. But for the vast majority, it looks like I haven't written a set of slides that's just going to tell you what you already know. So, as was recently said, my name is Hamish Freelander. As you can possibly tell from my ridiculous accent, I am not from the UK, I am from New Zealand. I flew over here last week, so you'd think I'd be over my jet lag by now, but hasn't worked out so well. And this is Silverstripe, the open source PHP CMS for Teams. I had a nice little trollish sort of blurb for this, but basically there's a separate title that I didn't use. I often come up with multiple titles for my speeches and then pick the one that I feel is going to look best on the website. But the title I didn't use is "What you are using now is terrible. Why do you keep hitting yourself?" I was here at PHP UK last year. I didn't actually get to see any of the presentations last year. I wasn't a speaker. I was helping man a booth up in the hall where everyone's just had some morning tea. And at the time, we hadn't quite opened our UK office. We were just about to do that, and we were over here to sort of let people know that Silverstripe exists. And I had a lot of conversations, and those conversations went along the lines of, so what's Silverstripe? And then I would tell them, and they would say, that sounds awesome. And I'd say, what do you use at the moment? And they would name various products. I'm not going to name the terrible things that you are using at the moment. That just seems mean. But there's, starts with W or D or other similar products. They would say, we're using that. And I would say, do you like it? And they would say, no. No, it is terrible. It drains our world. Every day we turn up to work and we have 6 coffees just so we can stand to use the computer. And I said, why do you use it then? And sometimes they would say, because our clients ask for it. That's a reasonable reason. Hopefully, once you've got a good relationship with your client, you're in a good enough position to be able to say, why did you choose this thing? Was it just because you'd heard of it, because some consultant told you? There are some better things. But also it was just, well, that's the thing we know, that's the thing we use. That doesn't seem a terribly good reason to keep using something that's terrible. So I'm hoping that I will convince at least some of you to try out Silverstripe, because it isn't terrible. Silverstripe is awesome. Now, admittedly, I am the CTO of the company that writes Silverstripe. I suspect that I would not be getting a salary next week if I was to come in here and say, Silverstripe's awful, you probably shouldn't use it. But I really do think it is awesome. I use it for my personal projects. I've been at Silverstripe for 7 years now, which is a really long time to be at a company, especially in IT. That's partly because the people are awesome, and partly because it's nice and safe, and looking for other jobs is scary, but mostly because I really like it. I really like working with the tool. I really like the projects we do, and I'm happy to be working on it. And I suspect that that doesn't go for everybody who works in IT, and that's a bit sad. So I'm hoping that I can help fix that. So here's a different title that I rejected. Web development better with friends. Computer programmers are not particularly well renowned for their social skills, but hopefully you have some friends, and if you have friends, probably some of them do development. But I used to run a one-man web shop. I lived in Bali for 4 years, and the entire time I did everything. I did all the design, I did all the development, I did all the hosting. That meant that when something went wrong, it was definitely my fault. That meant that I couldn't learn anything new. It meant that I couldn't work with anybody else. It made it really difficult to grow as a developer. It did mean I could do some things, like I could randomly pick whichever technology I felt like using at the time. That was nice. It meant I could learn a lot of different frameworks. But in general, I wish I had been working with someone else, And it's one of the things I enjoy most is that when I'm working at Silverstripe, I'm not working by myself, I'm working with a great bunch of people. So a very quick blurb about me. You're not here to see me, you're here to hear about Silverstripe, but pretty much the only reason that any speaker is going to be speaking is to soothe their own ego, so you get to hear me talk about me for 30 seconds anyway. Like I said, I'm CTO of Silverstripe. Silverstripe's based in New Zealand. I joined as a junior developer, and pretty quickly, partly through programming, partly through a little bit of flattery, partly through a very small amount of blackmail and murder, I became CTO. It doesn't really count if no one's found out yet. But as CTO, I still mostly do development. So that's who I am. I'm a developer. If you asked me what my job was, I would say I do computer programming, I do web development. I do management these days, but I don't really like it. I do tell people that they should be coding to a particular standard, but I avoid doing that as much as possible. The thing I enjoy most is doing web programming. And that's one of the reasons why I like Silverstripe, and we'll get into that in a little bit, but I find that many CMSs seem to try and avoid the things that I like the most. They don't like you to be doing programming, they like you to be doing other things. Of course, that's all when I'm not partying with all the other CTOs in our super secret elite parties in our space stations, because I joined the club. I totally know everyone in Seattle. Cool, so what is Silverstripe? Well, for a start, it's a company. It's a company in New Zealand. We hire about 80 people. We have an office in the UK. We hire Joel and Dan, who isn't in the room, and that has been noted. So it's a company that developed the Silverstripe software, but we also do a lot of other development. And I'm going to tell you a little origin story about Silverstripe. Every superhero has a good origin story. I see us as superheroes. We don't have any powers, but we do dress up in spandex. I apologize for the low quality of this particular background image, but it is Charles Dance, and once you find an image of Charles Dance in Google search, you stop searching. So about 12 years ago now, there were 3 friends in New Zealand, Sam and Tim and Sig, and they started a web development company. Some of you probably work for similar sort of companies now. They found clients who needed a website, and they made a website for them. And it was pretty simple. But they didn't really like any of the tools. It was 12 years ago. The tools were not as good as they are now. And so they wrote the first version of Silverstripe. It was IE6 only, which at the time was actually the best browser. It was IE6 only because Netscape Navigator 4 would randomly crash whenever it attempted to execute the JavaScript. It was also proprietary, and it wasn't really used anywhere except in Silverstripe. It used this really interesting PHP plugin that would obfuscate the code so that you couldn't take a copy of it and sell it. Anyway, it worked, but I wasn't at the company yet, and I hadn't told them how terrible this was. So for a while, they operated like that. And that worked fine, but then they really got a bit sick of the system they'd written. It had not been really architected very well. In the meantime, Rails had come out, and they really wanted to be using Rails, or something that wasn't the system they'd written. So they wrote Silverstripe 2.0, and as part of writing that, they open sourced it. That started them on the journey that they are today. The same system. The Silverstripe 1.0 code is gone. I'm glad it's gone. I've seen some of it. It was excellent code for a first web project, but not the sort of thing you want to base a long-term strategy on. The Silverstripe 2 code, a lot of it is still around. Some of it's really good. Some of it was written by someone who is now in sales, so we don't let him code anymore. But for the most part, it's still the same system as it was 8 years ago. And since then, we've just kept growing. But mostly what we've been doing is we've still just been writing websites for customers. The customers have gotten bigger. When we started out, it was small shops who had a couple of $1,000, $10,000 to build on a website. These days, it's banks and the New Zealand government and other fairly large corporations, but we still do websites for customers. And every improvement that goes into Silverstripe is there because we needed it to do our job developing websites. So we've defeated everyone in New Zealand, we've crushed all competition, or at least all the easy competition and all the hard competition's hard. So we've also started looking outwards. We've opened the UK office, we've created a product. I'm not really here to push the product, but I will tell you Silverstripe platform is awesome. If you do decide that you like Silverstripe and you need to host it, then you should totally use Silverstripe platform to do that. Plug over. So if we get back to the question, what is Silverstripe? Well, it's an open source PHP-based MVC framework for web development. So, like I mentioned, the founders really liked Rails. Rails was open source but written in Ruby. They, I don't know, what would you say, borrowed? Probably not stole, that has some bad connotations. There were inspirations from the Rails API in the Silverstripe framework, let's say. Modified a little bit because of the requirements that PHP had. PHP's not quite as good for writing DSLs as Ruby was, but a lot of inspiration from quite modern frameworks that were coming out at the time. It's also a, there we go. The framework has an active record style model interface. It's got some routing stuff, it's got a form builder, it's got a template language, so it's got a lot of the things you'd expect from a framework. And even if you don't use the CMS, we do projects where we just use the framework. I'm not really gonna, there'll be a code demo later, don't worry, it's not just me talking at you. But we do use projects that just use the framework. That's not really the focus of this talk. It's also an open source PHP-based CMS built on that framework. And the CMS layer is actually really thin. And we will get into that in the demo a little bit, is about how thin that CMS layer is and how powerful the framework is to let you build a CMS with not that much code. It has a WYSIWYG content editor, has versioning and workflow, drag and drop information architecture editor, and again, we'll demo all this in a bit, asset management, and all the other stuff you'd expect. So what is Silverstripe? It's born from the fires of battle. It's a CMS that wasn't written by design or by committee. It was a CMS that's written by a development shop doing development to let us do that development better. And so a lot of the influence in the design comes from the way that we develop websites. And as we've changed the way that we develop websites, as we've grown, the API and the systems that we use with Silverstripe have grown too. Now, if you don't develop websites exactly the same way as we do, Silverstripe may well still be applicable, but you should do it the same way as we do. We're best. So if you're doing some stuff different to us, then you're wrong. It's also a community. It's great that it's all open source. I love open source. It was one of the main reasons I took the job in the first place. Again, because then I get to put code on GitHub and get a little ego boost when people fork my repositories or whatever. Also, I'm sure for altruistic reasons that I can't think of at the moment. But yeah, I really like that it's open source, and that gives us a great community. We've got heaps of add-ons. We don't have as big a community as some of those CMSs that people don't like. I don't really understand why you'd join a community for a product you hate. I guess just to stand around with everyone else saying how much you hate it. But yeah, it's really good. So that's fine. Silverstripe's there to work the same way as we develop websites. What does that actually mean? I mean, how do you develop websites? We do it as a group. Like I said, web development is better with friends. A lot of development and a lot of CMSs say, well, you don't need this group, or here's how you can do it without these people, because these people are hard to find, or they're expensive, or you don't really like them, they're weird or techie, or for us, you know, they draw pretty pictures and tell you it's more important than performance, or you know, you end up with all of the little clicks in your development, in your web pantheon saying, well, we only need us. We don't need these other people. We think that's wrong. We think that you do need everyone in the group. You work better as a group. You need to have product managers, project managers. They need to tell you how far over budget you are. They need to tell you how late you are. You don't necessarily have to listen to them, but you need that information there. You need to have architects of various kinds, developers of various kinds, designers, content creators, marketing, customer relation managers. If you don't have those people involved in your team, you're not going to have as good a website as if you do. You can manage. People manage all the time. You know, people can manage running a whole website and running all those jobs by themselves, But if you've only got one person, or if you've got a person trying to do multiple jobs and they're not specializing in things, you'll manage, but the outcome won't be as good as if you had experts in all of these areas, if you had a team working together. And you want to have T-shaped people. T-shaped means that you're really good at one thing. That's the stalker. It should actually be upside down T, I guess, but there's no such letter in the alphabet, so T will do. You want to have one skill that you're really good at, but a bunch of other skills that you're at least knowledgeable about. And actually working in a team helps make sure that your team's shaped, because when you're working with these other people who have these other skills, some of that's going to rub off on you. Unless you're deliberately ignoring them or don't want to learn, you're going to learn some of those skills from those people. And development, it's an interesting, it's different on my screen to up on that screen, that's fine. When we're working on a feature, if we're working on a website, this is the basic cycle it follows. If any of you run in Scrum teams, this should look fairly familiar because it follows the standard Scrum cycle. You end up with, that definitely is wrong, that's all right. You end up with a need. The client, the customer, finds a need. They find something that they want to do with the website they can't. You shouldn't be coming up with this because you don't know what they need. If you're a developer, if you're a designer working on the website, don't try and pick a need. Listen to the customer. They'll tell you what they want. Then you write some scope. Then you code it. Then you put it in a version control system. You demo it to the client. You upload it to your UAT server. You test it. And you put it on your live server. Now, none of that should be terribly confrontational or surprising or new. Pretty much everyone knows that if you're developing complex features, you should be putting it in version control. If you're not using version control, I can't help you. I'm sorry. You should ideally be putting it on UAT and demoing it to the client prior to it going to production. If it's going into production before the client is seeing it, good luck. So, people work best when they care. Our most successful projects are the ones where the whole team is engaged and feels ownership. And again, this is why we want to work with teams. So how does Silverstripe CMS help? For a start, there's no duck programs in the database. What do we mean by that? Well, everyone knows what duck typing is. If it looks like a duck and walks like a duck, it's a duck. Duck programming is the same thing, but for code. If you're in a web interface and you are connecting if statements together, it doesn't matter if you're doing that in a text editor or in a little GUI drag and drop interface in the website, it's still programming. It doesn't matter if you've been told it's programming or you've learnt it through a CMS tutorial, it's still programming. And if you're storing it in the database, you can't deploy it. It's not really versioned. It's not reversible. If you deploy something and then you don't like it, how do you deal with that later? So developers already have great tools for dealing with this. We already have Git, we already have continuous deployment, we already have continuous integration to test this stuff. Writing it into the database destroys all of that value. We have a separation of church and state, by which I mean developers and designers. We have template languages. We keep the code where it needs to be. We don't have just PHP to be our template language. And we have a focused content editing experience. When you give a content editor the CMS, there shouldn't be a button in there that they can click that says ruin their website. It probably doesn't say ruin their website, but that's even worse. If there's a button that doesn't say ruin your website that does, that's a pretty bad experience for the content editor. And a lot of CMSs do this. A lot of CMSs have, hey, here's all the programming stuff, just click here and add some more stuff, it'll be fine. I mean, you're in production, but don't worry about it. No, sorry, something went wrong, your whole site's down. I guess call the developer you haven't called in 6 months. He'll sort it out for you 24/7, I'm sure. It'll be fine. It shouldn't be scary. You should be providing just the fields they need. And you should separate templates and code. So, with all that said, I wanted to get to an actual demo of Silverstripe so that you can see all of that in action. And I'm now going to switch to PHP Storm and then try and twist this lectern around and see how we go. Actually, I might just move this over here. There we go. Safe. Thanks. Hello, everyone can still see me? Good. So, the first thing that we'll have a look at is just a default install of Silverstripe. No, sorry. You'll have to bear with me a second while I mess around with the... I'm just going to clone the displays, and then I can see what you're seeing without craning my neck. Perfect. Cool, so we've got a default installation of Silverstripe. Silverstripe is adopting modern PSRs and technologies as they come around. So to get a copy of Silverstripe, I've run Composer. And I've just run Composer create project Silverstripe to get the default code base. And the interface you get, here's the front end. It's got some default content. It's not very exciting. It's a default template. Again, not very exciting. But it also gives you a full admin interface. And here's the admin interface you get. Straight out of the box, we've got a tree that you can see that you can browse around. We've got a WYSIWYG editor. We've got the information about the page, the navigation title. There is some metadata stuff that's hidden away. And again, hide things from the editor unless they need them. We've got some settings, some history. If we come into Contact Us, there's another page. And some fairly standard CMS editing features. If we add some more content, we can save the draft of that. We can share that draft around, but it's not visible on the live site yet. At any point, we can decide to publish it. And now it's shown up in the main site. Now, I'm not going to take you through too many features of the CMS because we've got some really good demos systems that you can already try out. If you just go to silverstripe.org, there's a demo that you can get into to explore these basic features. What I wanted to show you is developing a new feature in Silverstripe because that's what's different to other CMSs. And this is going to be a little bit of live coding, except that I've already pre-prepared a bunch just in case I get it wrong, because I probably will. And so I'm sorry that you can't see the structure of the code very well in PHP Storm. PHP Storm is not terribly presenter friendly, but I need the autocomplete stuff. If I tried doing this in Atom, it would take 3 times as long. Yeah, someone was telling me that. I haven't used it enough to know. So, but primarily we're going to be working inside the MySite directory. Silverstripe is a collection of modules. Even your site-specific code is just a module. You've got the framework module and the CMS module. So we're just going to be adding code into the MySite module. And the first thing I'm going to do is a new and exciting example I thought really hard about that you won't have seen before. I'm going to be working on a basic to-do list. So here's the version I preferred earlier that I'm just going to cheat and reference. Right, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new model. So I've already gone and talked to the customer. I've figured out their requirements. I haven't just come out with them out of my head. And I'm going to create some code. Because I'm thinking ahead, I'm going to create a new directory for it. Call it models. And then inside there, I'm going to create a to-do model. So the file is called to-do.php. I'm going to extend off data object. Data object is the base class for all serializable objects that live in the database. And then I'm going to give it a couple of fields. Title. And did I just call it? I just called it varchar. And completed. And I'm going to have a has1 to a member. Now, Silverstripe comes with the concept of members and groups and permissions and security already baked in, so we don't have to go and define member. It already exists. And what we've created here is a model. It has 2 fields and a reference to the owner. Now, I don't have to do anything in the database to get that to exist. Silverstripe has a schema management system, so by just declaring that new model, I can run dev build, and it will see that there is a new model, and it will create all of the tables in my database for me. It does this in a safe way so that if you do need to revert back to old code, as long as you haven't changed the type of a field, you can revert back. I would still recommend backing your databases up during deployment anyway, but it's designed so that as a developer you can add fields and remove fields. It's not going to damage the data in your database. So that's fine, but we haven't done anything with the model. It exists. We could write it into the database, but we can't see it. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create an admin interface so that we can create and edit those to-do items. And I'm going to create another directory. We're going to call it admin. And I'm going to create another file in that directory. And you'll notice that I'm not registering these files anywhere. I'm not having to go and say this is a new admin area or this is a new model. Silverstripe has a manifest that knows where all the classes are inside your code base. Will auto-detect all of these things for you as you create them. So we're creating to-do admin. And there's a base class for creating administrator interfaces called model admin. I'm just going to cheat and look up the 3 statics that have to be declared. Bless you. So we've said the models that this admin area are going to manage are the to-do model. The URL segment is going to be to-dos, and the menu title is to-do. Now, if we come back into the admin area and reload this admin area, you'll notice that I'm putting the flush get parameter on the URL a lot. That basically says update the manifest, find the new files that exist. You wouldn't do that all the time on live because it's a little bit slow. And now there's a new to-do area. And we've already got our admin interface. Now, I haven't scaffolded this in that I haven't gone and created a bunch of files that I'll then have to manage later. All of this admin interface is being generated by code on the fly when you hit this interface, and you can modify the fields that are being generated to adjust the interfaces you'd like to, and I'll show you how to do some of that in a bit. But we've already got the ability to add a to-do. We'll call it, I'd like to learn how to bake a sponge cake, and I'm just going to make, there's only one user in the system and it's owned by me. And I'd also like to know how to cook brownies. Apparently I'm going to be putting on quite a lot of weight. And this is already a perfectly functional interface. We're not really doing anything with these to-dos, but within about 5 minutes, we've got the ability to admin them within the admin area. So the next thing I'm going to want to do is actually, that's okay, but a big list of to-dos, that's not very useful. I want to be able to put them in sets, not just because for a synthetic example it makes a nice piece of code, but also because it would actually be useful, I'm sure. And again, I'm just going to cheat and look at my... Right, so I'm going to create another model. We'll call it to-do set. And it'll extend data object again. Now, I'll show you this a bit later, but Silverstripe handles deep class hierarchies fine. At the moment, I'm inheriting straight off data object, but you can inherit off other things that inherit off data object. No problem, it'll handle it all with multi-table inheritance in the background. Now we're going to have one field, which is just going to be the title. We're going to have a has many, because this set is going to have many to-dos. And then again, we're going to have an owner. Owner goes to member. And then the other thing that we're going to need to do is provide the other side of that has many. So in to do, I'm going to say it has one set. Cool. So if I go and run dev build, again, it will have created the table that we need. It will have updated the to-do table, and we've created the new to-do set table. Again, I've created the model, but I don't have an interface for it yet, so we're now going to add that to the admin interface. And this is even easier than the last time we did this. I'm just going to add to-do set in here. And now if we flush, so now we have two tabs, to-dos and to-do sets. We can come into a to-do set. We'll call it recipes I'd like to learn. Give it the owner of me, create it. And now we have a system where we can find all of the to-dos I've already created, link them into this to-do set. So we'll add both those. And maybe I want to cook jam donuts.
Exercise more.
Yeah, at a different set, yeah. And again, we create the default admin. But there is at least one problem with the system so far, and in order to show it to you, I'm going to have to create a second member. So let's call John Smith, and he doesn't really need an email address, but it's john@example.com. Super complex, definitely unhackable password of password. You can disable being able to set things like password in the password field, but I've turned that off for now because I can remember password. So now if we add another to-do, and we call it ride a bicycle, which I would have to remember how to spell, and we set it to be owned by John Smith, we can come into the to-do set of the default admin, and if we try and find that, it still shows up. So the problem is that the grid fields don't know what owner means, so you're able to link to-dos that aren't owned by the same person as the to-do set. We need to fix that. And in order to fix that, conveniently, we have to tweak the admin interface that's being generated for us. So let's do that. Right, so the system that Silverstripe uses to build these CMS fields is that it calls a method called getCMSFields on your model. Now, if you don't override that, it will fall down to the one that DataObject provides, and DataObject will scaffold something up for you. But that makes it fairly easy to override as well, because you can just come into your model. You can provide your own version of that function. Oops. What did I do there? Sorry. I'm just going to retype that in. So the first thing that we do is we still want to use the scaffolded fields. We just want to adjust them. Now, in this case, what we're going to be editing is and I'm going to need to. In this case, what we're going to be changing is that, oops, yeah, I've broken there's an extra plus there. So in this case, I'm going to be changing the drop down here to only show sets that are owned by the same person as the to-do, as the only show to-do sets that are owned by the same owner as this to-do is owned by. So we've already got the scaffolded fields. What we need to do is we need to change the set of data that this dropdown is using. So we're going to go and get that individual field out of the already scaffolded fields. That looks a bit magic, but you can actually, the easiest way to find that is just to inspect the form, and the ID is in that form field already. Or there's a specific algorithm that generates those field names, so you can always guess them once you've gotten used to it. Then we're going to set the source on that field. Now, if we just did that, then that's going to be doing exactly the same thing as the default scaffolded field does. It just goes and gets all of the to-do sets, turns them into a map of IDs to titles, and sets them as the source. But we need to filter them to be owned by the same owner as this model. So and that's the same as that. And now when we come in to see, when we look at the sponge cake to do, because it's owned by default admin, we can see the recipes I'd like to learn to do set. If we come in to ride a bicycle, there's nothing available because John Smith doesn't have a to do set yet. So that's one side, but we need to do the other side. And this one is a little bit more complicated because we're editing the grid field. But again, it's the same basic principle. We're going to take the fields that are scaffolded. In this case, we're just going to remove the to-dos grid field that's scaffolded because we want to change it completely. Now we're going to create a new configuration for the grid field. The grid field is that table that's being used to edit a relationship. I wonder if I've got one I can show you without reloading. No, I'd have to reload it. Maybe I'll do that anyway, just so you can see. So this is a grid field here. And if we come into to-do set, this is a grid field. If we come in, so I've broken the to-dos anyway. But so that when you're editing a relationship, that field is the grid field. So we're creating a new configuration. We're using the relation editor configuration, which is a preset configuration, and we're just going to adjust it a little bit. We are going to find the part of the configuration which is the link existing one, and we're going to change the search list. And again, the only thing we're changing is that we're filtering it to have the same owner ID as the owner ID of this to-do set. Then we create a grid, we add that to the set of fields, and we return the fields. And we remove all the stuff I copy-pasted in. So now when we come into the to-do set, we come in here, we go to add existing, it's not going to find that ride a bicycle because it's now outside of that search list. So, again, that's a fairly synthetic example, but what I wanted to show is how quickly you can build up really complex user interfaces for your clients in code. Now, there is a form builder that you can install into Silverstripe, but it's for reasonably basic forms, and it doesn't have the advantage of storing things in code like you can commit it to your version control history, you can run it tests through. Anytime you're doing duck programming inside the database, you're losing all of that stuff that, as programmers, we've sort of built up as techniques to make sure your site's operating. So the last thing that we'll do is, okay, that's fine, but it's all in the admin interface. I want to actually see these to-dos inside the front-end interface because there's no point if the only people that can edit it are the people who are in the admin. So I'm going to open up the page.php class. Now, this is getting into the CMS. So you saw that I was creating a to-do model and a to-do set model, and they were inheriting directly off data object. The CMS uses exactly the same method. When you've got a page in the tree in your site, there is a class called site tree. It inherits off data object. It sets some default fields that exist on a page, like content and a title and a URL. But all of the interface is built the same way as I just showed you. It's going to scaffold up the base fields, and it's going to adjust some of them. It's going to present you with that CMS interface. And in order to add new page types, all you do is you inherit from the site tree model, and you add your own fields. And because all of those scaffolding techniques are still there, you can just use getCMS fields to adjust the interface you're presented with on the page for your new fields. By default, you'll always have one page type, which is page, and you'll have a controller which handles any requests that land on that page. You don't have to have anything in it. There's an index action that will render your page with a template for you. I don't think we're going to have time to show you that, but if we do, that would be awesome. But what I am going to do, we've got about 20 minutes left.
We'd like to save some time for questions.
Yep, cool. So what I am going to do is I'm going to just quickly run through adding this into the front end. So I've added a function called to-do sets. Now, because this is not in allowed actions, it's not directly callable from the web. So what we're doing here is adding a method that will be called in a template. And I'm going to adjust the template in a second. The first thing that we're doing is we're just using the ORM to go and get all of the to-dos that are owned by the current user. Now, actually, in proper code, maybe I would move that to an accessor on the to-do set model itself. But I'm going to change the example that I've carefully scripted to do that, because I'm sure that's safe. Cool, so I've added a static function to the to-do set model called getAllForMember. You can either pass the member in, or you can just leave the member blank, in which case it'll use whoever's currently logged in. So we're now going to come into page and call great, and now I don't feel so bad about the code I wrote. Then we're going to build so by default, we could, I'm just going to show you that. So, great, I've added an accessor, what's going to call that function. So we need to go into the template to do that. In Silverstripe, because you've got that class hierarchy, you can have a template specific to your class. If you don't define one specific to your class, it'll just fall down the class hierarchy. So if you had homepage which inherits off page, you can either define the homepage template, or you can just use the page template. In this case, we're just going to use the page template. And I'm just going to come in here and I'm going to say, if there are to-do sets, then I'm going to add a unsorted list and then loop through those to-do sets and have a list item that shows the title of that to-do set. And now if we reload the any page, because I've just added that to the home page, it's just going to show the title of the to-do set. We could loop through the to-dos. Oops. And there you go. So you've pulled that all into the front end. But that's just showing us the to-dos. We actually want a form in there that we can check to say, I've done this to-do. So in order to do that, we can't just return the models. We need to augment the models with some additional information, which is the form, so that when we pass them into the template can actually ask for the form instead of just the things that exist in the model. And to do that, we're going to build a separate list. I'm going to speed up a little bit. For each set that this user owns, we're going to add an item to a list, and we're going to customize that item in addition to all of the properties that are available on the model, we're going to add an additional property to that model, which is the to-do form. This calls a method on this object called to-do form that doesn't exist, so we'll have to add that. And this is quite a long model, quite a long thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to check this commit out. Oops. There we go, and all my code magically appeared. So the to-do form, I'll run through very quickly. It's called twice. It's called once from this model when we're calling through the template. It's also called when you submit the form through the URL. So you can't, we're passing in an argument here, which is the to-do set we want to build a form for, but that argument won't come back through the query when it's come from the browser. The browser doesn't have all of that information. Instead, we're going to set a hidden variable called setID. You should be checking to make sure that the setID is owned by the user, so you can't just pass in any setID and hack into someone else's to-do set, but I'm not doing that in this code. We create a field list. We add 2 fields to it. The first is a checkbox set field, and the second is that hidden field that tracks setID. We also create a new action called update. When you click the update button, it will call the save to do method on this controller. So that's what these 2 lines say. That says there is an action, the label on the button should be update, the method to call should be save to do, and the controller that method lives on is this controller. There is a little bit of interesting stuff in the query here, but otherwise it's just you're passing in some arguments to the checkbox set field to see here's how you get the IDs and titles for the various to-dos. And then the last thing we're doing is once you actually submit that form, you have this method, and this is the method that will be called when the form is submitted with the data that's submitted. So again, we need to go and get the set using that hidden set ID. We need to get all of the checkbox information. It might not exist. If you don't check any of the checkboxes, then browsers don't bother to pass anything through, which is a little bit irritating because your code will crash if you just assume it's there, but we're skipping that. We're checking to see if it's there. And then for all of the to-dos in the set, if it was checked, then set completed. If it wasn't checked, then clear completed, and then write the to-do. And then finally, at the end of the submission, redirect back to the page you came from. So I'm going to show you what that looks like in the page. And I'm going to need to also check out I've got 2 separate Git repositories. So if we look in that template, which I've just adjusted, now we're saying if there are any to-do sets, let's put a nice motivating title in there to get people to get some stuff done, and then loop through all of those to-do sets, but now call that new parameter that we've augmented that model with in our controller. And the result is that we will get a nice form. If we look at that form, you can see that it's created the form for us. It's created the action for us, which is the title of that to-do form. There is a bunch of stuff in Silverstripe to make sure you're submitting to a form correctly and securely. There's CSRF protection automatically got created for us. And if we check 2 of those checkboxes, I wonder if either I haven't flushed or it's not in there. It is in there, so I haven't flushed. Let's close off the inspector. So that's not super exciting, it's just persisting the checkbox, but we now have a form by which you can check off your to-dos in your interface. If we don't have this redirect back, and instead we just print out the data, you can see what's happening. So now when we submit, it's going to submit it to the form, it's going to call that method. The method is showing you the data that's being passed through into that method, and then we just said dump the data out and exit. So you can see that what happens is when you submit the form, it calls this method, we process it, and then we redirect back to the page we were on. You don't have to redirect back, you can redirect wherever you'd like to. You could also render a different response, but redirect back is by far the most common.
We will have another 5 or 10 minutes here. If there are questions,
Yeah.
if questions from the room are assembling, emerging, or there's something that you need to check that he's done in the last 10, 15 minutes here, show a hand, I'll run around with a microphone. Otherwise,
There we go.
what was next feature, Hamish?
Sorry?
What was next feature?
So the next thing that I have in the code, and I wasn't sure if we get to because I didn't get to it in the run-through, is that I add a carousel into the home page that you can edit through the admin interface. And again, we're just adding a couple of fields to the page model. We're adjusting a grid field to let you select images. There's already image management in the CMS, and then rendering it into the home page as a carousel. And I can show you that code, but I can't really run through it.
Can I just ask a question about what the database looks like?
Sure.
I'm over here, by the way.
Hi.
Hi.
So
I see you kind of doing all the data object stuff, which is interesting. You've created a new to-do, et cetera, et cetera. But what does that actually look like and get stored in the data structure in the back end?
So I'll pull up SQL Pro, and we can have a look. I don't normally use this. So you can see I haven't bothered to clear out my old databases for a while. What was the name of this? This was, what was the name of the project? By default, it will name your database the same as the name of the directory it's in, so Silver Stripe for Teams example. There we go. So the to-do will be nice and clean because there's no inheritance and there's no versioning. So in that case, if you look at the to-do, I wonder if we can increase the size of that somehow. Sorry? I wonder if I can just hold down.
Command plus, yeah.
I couldn't see. Was there something in there and I was missing it? Oh, I can look down here. No, that's just going to pick the monospaced font. That's not going to help me. I'm going to give the AV guys conniptions and try and change the... There we go. Can people read that now? Cool. So basically, there is... where's the schema? So there are 8 fields. We always set ID, and it's always an auto. We don't try and use a what's the term for an ID that's natural to the data. We always create an auto-generated numeric ID. We have the class name that's used for inheritance. We need to know for each row what the class, because we do multi-table inheritance. I'll take that through in a second. We always have last edited and created. Those are added by the ORM. And then we have the 4 fields that we defined in our model. Now, when we do have inheritance, we use multi-table inheritance. So you can see, for instance, with site tree and page, site tree is the base class, and we have all of the fields that site tree defines, so the URL, the title, the content, the things like that. But we also have the page So we're not actually defining any fields on page, so it doesn't bother to create a table for us. There is a different page called virtual page which inherits, and that just has the 3 fields that are specific to that class. Silverstripe will then do a join across the ID, so the ID will be the same for any particular object within virtual page and SideTree.
So every data object that's created, it then creates its own unique table for the data that exists inside that.
Yes, as long as it actually has fields. So you can create classes that have methods, so accesses or things to be called by the template or whatever. But if you don't define any database fields or any has-one relationships, and so it doesn't need any fields, it won't create a table at that point.
Okay, so for example, sorry, I'm going
Yeah.
specific. If I'm interrupting anyone else, just tell me to shut up and you can have the microphone. So if you were to create a person, for example, and you would create a person data object, it would extend the data object, like you then get a person.
Yeah.
If you wanted to have an actor, which is a person that has appeared in a film,
Yes.
you would create an actor which would extend a person. If you were to have a waiter, for example, they would have had to work in a restaurant.
Yeah.
You would have then 3 tables created by Silverstripe.
Yes, and so you might want to consider whether you're going to create, I mean, for a start, someone can be a waiter and an actor.
Of course.
So you might want
But you
have
want to
that
look
system.
in both of those tables to find out.
Yeah, well,
Kind of, maybe, perhaps.
you might want to have like a job object that's linked. But yeah, in that specific example, yes, you would have some tables. And so if you can end up with situations where you end up with a lot of tables if you're creating your object model without thought about how.
So is object modeled the database, essentially? Okay. That's probably what I should have asked in the first place.
Yeah.
We always get there in the end. Other questions? Yeah.
You were showing that you don't have to register your modules anywhere. Let's say something goes wrong. Is there a way to disable a module? Or let's say the to-do list without actually removing it from the code? Like some administration?
So that you don't want the controller, so you don't want the model to exist, or you just don't want the...
turn it off, for example.
So you could either remove all of the actions from allowed actions. That would prevent it from being accessed over the web, but it would still exist. You could just not have it inherit from data object, in which case it won't be discovered as a data object. You would have to be a little bit careful if you did that, because if you ran dev build, it's not there anymore, so it's going to rename that table and call it obsolete. It won't delete the data, but it's also not going to get it back for you if you then recreate the model again. So it depends a little bit on what you mean by turn it off. You certainly can. There's multiple ways I can think of to solve that problem, but it depends a little bit by what effect you're trying to achieve, whether it's for security reasons, or you don't want the users to be able to see it, or you don't want the admin to be able to see it, or you actually want it to go away from the database for a while.
One more at the back there.
Yeah, in your models, when you obviously you can add fields and flush, and it'll add them to the database. And I think you may have mentioned this, but I didn't quite catch what you said. Does it drop the fields as well if you take them out of your model and then run flush?
So if you take them out of your model and then run dev build, it will rename the column to be obsolete underscore and then the name of the field. It doesn't want to remove the data. Just in case you, like especially during development, you might be changing, adding and removing the field quite a lot. And if you've got a whole bunch of data in there, it doesn't want to drop that column. There is then a task you can run which says look through the database to find things called obsolete and drop them. But you want to be a bit careful about doing that.
And subsequently, if you bring it back into the model, will it just rename the obsolete, or will you get an obsolete underscore obsolete sort of scenario?
No. So it should, but I have been surprised before. So that's something that it should pull them back in again, but I would test that before relying on that, especially for production data.
And just finally, one thing. Your deployment method would be then to, once you've finished developing,
Yeah.
you would then run the flush on
That's
production.
right. Yeah. So we deploy into UAT with the code. Then you run dev build flush on the UAT side. You make sure everything's good, and then you take that same code, deploy to production, and then you run dev build. Now, because you've already done that on UAT and your database should have been the same as on live, you already know the schema change it's going to make, so you already know it's going to be fairly safe. There are methods you can hook into to create new records when that dev build happens. So if you need to create new default data or modify your schema, or You know, like if you're changing the schema in such a way that you need your data to be updated, you can hook into that schema regeneration process to adjust your data during that process.
Okay.
But also, in most cases, we try and back up the database prior to running that dev build, even when we know it's going to work, just for those times that databases decide they don't like what should work. Like, for instance, although UAT and live should be exactly the same, and we try and enforce that, there are situations where, like if our ops guys have gone in and loaded a database on client request, it might no longer be the same as the live database.
Well, I hear there's some great documentation online.
Thank you.
And
Yes.
3 offices, so there's a UK office now.
Yep, so there's a UK office. I just saw Dan standing at the door before, but he's disappeared again. He's our solution architect we've got over here. And Joel, who was, there he is, he's there. Track either of them down, or track me down during the conference, or you're in the rainmaking loft, but you can't get in there. You'll have to organise an appointment or something. But they're around and happy to talk to people more about Silverstripe. I'm at HA Friedlander on Twitter, and there's at Silverstripe. HA Friedlander is also my GitHub handle. I have a AMA on GitHub. So if you want to ask me Silverstripe questions or non-Silverstripe questions. So far, all of the questions on it have been about whether I would fight 100 duck-sized horses or 1 horse-sized duck, which is not terribly Silverstripe specific. But
thank you very much,
feel free to
Hamish.
contact me on there, or hamish@silverstripe.com.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Please remember, have a look at the feedback online as well. And the next piece in here is Beth Chuckalong in about 10 minutes.